Hello and welcome to the channel. Before we begin, please make sure you are subscribed and have turned on notifications so you won't miss our next story. And now, let's get started. Lyra had always believed her hatred was the purest thing about her. A warrior Omega from the frostbitten northern reach, she had forged her grief into a weapon, honing it daily against the whetstone of memory. At 24, she was the deadliest assassin in the Northern Rebellion, a phantom known only as the Shadow Wolf, and she believed with every fiber of her being that her life had a single, righteous purpose: to drive her dagger through the heart of the tyrant who sat on the onyx throne, Queen Seraphina. She thought she understood the shape of her destiny, a straight, blood-soaked line from her parents' unjust execution to the Queen's final, gurgling breath. Until the night of the Midwinter Gala, the night she finally came face to face with her sworn enemy, and everything she thought was true shattered into a million impossible pieces. The Grand Hall of the Citadel was an obscene spectacle of wealth and waste, a direct insult to the starving families of the North. Crystal chandeliers, each larger than a northern pony, dripped light onto gilded floors. Nobles in silks and velvets laughed, their voices like the tinkling of ice, oblivious to the suffering that paid for their comfort. Lyra moved among them, invisible in the plain gray livery of a palace servant, a tray of delicate wine glasses balanced on one hand. Her other hand rested near the small of her back, where a thin, perfectly weighted stiletto was nestled against her skin. Contempt was a cold, hard knot in her stomach. These were the sycophants, the parasites who grew fat while the queen bled the provinces dry. Every smile she saw, every casual toast, fueled the fire that had burned inside her for a decade. She observed the royal guard, their crimson and gold uniforms a stark warning. Their patrol routes were predictable, their vigilance dulled by the wine and the false sense of security within these stone walls. Lyra had studied the blueprints for months, memorizing every servant's passage, every forgotten corridor. She was more familiar with the castle's secrets than the guards who walked its halls every day. Her eyes found the throne. And her. Queen Seraphina was an effigy of ice and silver. Her gown was the color of a winter sky at dusk, embroidered with what looked like actual diamonds that caught the light with blinding intensity. A crown of twisted silver rested on her head, framing a face of impossible, severe beauty. She looked bored, her expression a mask of cool indifference as she accepted the fawning greetings of her courtiers. There was no warmth in her, no life. Just a cold, regal emptiness that perfectly matched the stories Lyra had been told. The Iron Queen. The tyrant of the South. The woman who signed her parents' death warrant without a flicker of emotion. Lyra's heart hammered a rhythm of pure, unadulterated loathing against her ribs. That woman, that creature of detached cruelty, was the reason Lyra's childhood had ended in fire and blood. The image of her mother and father, accused of treason and paraded before a jeering crowd, was seared into her mind. She had been 14, hidden in the throng, helpless as the executioner's axe fell. The queen, newly crowned, had watched from a balcony, her face as impassive as it was now. That memory was the engine of Lyra's existence. Soon, she promised the ghosts of her parents. Soon it will be done. The opportunity came hours later, when the gala was beginning to wane. A dignitary from the Summer Isles was delivering a painfully long-winded speech, and the queen, feigning a headache, dismissed her immediate retinue for a moment of peace. Lyra saw her chance. Slipping into a narrow alcove hidden by a heavy tapestry depicting a legendary battle, she found the concealed door she knew was there. The air in the passage was cool and damp, a stark contrast to the stifling heat of the ballroom. She moved with the silence that had earned her the name Shadow Wolf, her soft-soled boots making no sound on the worn stone. The passage led out into another, smaller antechamber directly behind the throne. She listened, her senses on high alert. The drone of the speech was muffled, distant. She could hear the soft crackle of the fire in the hearth. She heard a sigh, soft and weary. The queen was alone. This was it. 10 years of planning, of training, of burying her Omega nature under a mountain of warrior's discipline, all led to this single moment. She pushed aside the tapestry and stepped into the throne room. Queen Seraphina was standing by the fire, her back to the throne, rubbing her temples. For a fleeting second, stripped of her court and her crown which she'd set on the arm of the throne, she looked tired. Human. Lyra crushed the thought. A snake was still a snake, even when it was sleeping. Lyra drew her stiletto, the polished steel gleaming in the firelight. For the northern reach, she whispered, her voice a low, vicious snarl. The queen spun around, her silver eyes widening not with fear, but with a sudden, sharp shock of recognition that made no sense. Lyra didn't hesitate. She lunged, crossing the space between them in 2 silent strides, the dagger aimed directly at the queen's heart. In that final, critical instant, as she drew near enough to see the flecks of gray in the queen's silver eyes, it hit her. A scent. It wasn't the cloying perfume of the court or the smoke from the hearth. It was something primal, elemental, and devastatingly familiar. Pine needles after a frost. The clean, sharp scent of ozone before a blizzard. The comforting aroma of cedarwood smoke. It was the scent of home, the scent of safety, the scent of mate. Her omega instincts, brutally suppressed since her first heat, erupted with the force of a volcano. Her body, trained for a decade to be a weapon, betrayed her. Her lunge faltered, her muscles locking up. The forward momentum carried her, but her arm went weak, the stiletto slipping from her numb fingers and clattering onto the marble floor with a sound that echoed like a death knell. The world narrowed to that scent, to the woman in front of her. A deep, resonant hum started in her chest, a soul-deep vibration that recognized its other half. She stared at the queen, her mind a maelstrom of denial and horror. It was impossible. A curse. A lie. But she saw it reflected in the queen's face. Seraphina's regal mask had crumbled, her expression one of pure, unadulterated shock. Her lips were slightly parted, and her gaze was fixed on Lyra, filled with the same dawning, terrifying understanding. You, Seraphina breathed, the word a wisp of sound. The universe had played the cruelest possible joke. Her sworn enemy, the source of all her pain, the object of a decade of murderous obsession, was her true mate. Lyra stumbled back, a choked gasp tearing from her throat. She felt dizzy, nauseous. The very foundation of her identity, her entire reason for being, had just been obliterated. She couldn't breathe. Turning on her heel, she fled. She didn't look back. She plunged through the tapestry, scrambled down the secret passage, her heart pounding with a new kind of terror. It wasn't the fear of capture, it was the fear of a truth so monstrous it threatened to unmake her. She burst out into the servants' corridors, tearing off the gray tunic as she ran, and melted back into the shadows of the castle grounds. She didn't stop running until the citadel was a distant silhouette against the moonlit sky. Back at the hidden rebel camp in the woods, she collapsed in her tent, shaking uncontrollably. Her pack leader, a grizzled beta named Kale, found her there. What happened? Was the security too tight? He asked, his voice rough with concern. Lyra couldn't form the words. She couldn't say, I had her cornered, and I failed because she is my fated mate. The words were acid in her mouth. The moment wasn't right, she lied, the falsehood feeling like ash on her tongue. There were too many variables. Kale accepted it without question. No one ever questioned the Shadow Wolf. But she questioned herself. The bond was a physical torment, a phantom limb that ached for something she was conditioned to despise. She couldn't sleep. The scent of pine and winter clung to her senses, haunting her waking moments and her dreams. This cosmic cruelty was too specific to be random. There had to be a reason. Driven by a desperate, agonizing need to understand, Lyra began a new mission. Not of assassination, but of investigation. She had to reconcile the monster from her memories with the mate her soul was screaming for. She used the rebellion's network of spies and informants, not to find weaknesses in the Queen's defenses, but to find the truth of her past. She started with her parents' trial. She bribed a disgruntled clerk in the royal archives for the official transcripts. Reading them, she felt the first crack appear in the edifice of her hatred. The evidence was circumstantial, flimsy. The chief accuser was a man fiercely loyal to Duke Valerius, the Queen's hand, and a man known for his ambition. The prosecution's key witness, a merchant who claimed to have overheard her parents plotting, had been granted a massive estate by the Duke shortly after the trial, and then had conveniently disappeared on a trading voyage from which he never returned. The final piece was the death warrant itself. The clerk had procured a copy for her. Queen Seraphina's signature, usually a strong, confident script, was thin, hesitant, almost spidery, as if the hand that held the pen was trembling. The more she dug, the more the official narrative unraveled. She learned that in the first year of her reign, the young Queen Seraphina had been largely a figurehead, her power curtailed by a council stacked with old, powerful men loyal to her late father's advisors, chief among them Duke Valerius. The seizure of northern lands, the punitive taxes, the harsh sentences, all had been proposed by the Duke and rubber-stamped by a council that held the real power. The Queen had been a prisoner on her own throne. Lyra felt a cold dread creep into her heart. The hatred that had been her constant companion for 10 years began to feel hollow, misplaced. The bond, that infuriating, undeniable pull, pulsed with a new, agonizing question. What if she was wrong? What if she had spent her entire life hunting the wrong person? The uncertainty was worse than the hate. She had to know. She had to hear it from the Queen herself. 2 weeks after the gala, Lyra infiltrated the castle again. This time, she wasn't armed with a dagger, but with a sheaf of copy documents and a soul full of terrifying questions. She used the same passages, moving with a heavy heart through the silent stone veins of the citadel. She found the Queen not in the throne room, but in her private study. The room was filled with books and maps, a fire crackling in the hearth. Seraphina was at her desk, poring over a ledger, her silver blonde hair unbound and falling over her shoulders. She looked up as Lyra stepped out of the shadows, her expression not of alarm, but of weary expectation. It was clear she had been waiting. "I knew you would come back," Seraphina said, her voice quiet. She made no move to call the guards. "We need to talk," Lyra said, her own voice unsteady. She dropped the documents onto the polished wood of the desk. "My parents." "Tell me the truth." Seraphina looked at the papers, then back at Lyra, her silver eyes filled with a decade of unshed grief. "The truth," she began, her voice raw, "is that your parents were the most loyal people in this kingdom, and I condemn them to die." The story spilled out of her, a torrent of political intrigue and heartbreaking necessity. Duke Valerius, her father's most trusted advisor, had been plotting to usurp the throne since the day she was crowned. Lyra's parents, Lord and Lady Heiress of the North, had uncovered his treason. They sent a secret message to the Queen, warning her, but Valerius intercepted it. He moved first, using the intercepted message to frame them, twisting their words of loyalty into a plot against the crown. "I was 18, Seraphina said, her regal composure finally breaking, her voice thick with pain. "My counsel was his. The army was loyal to him. If I had defended your parents, he would have called me a traitor and started a civil war that would have torn the kingdom apart. Thousands would have died. She had been trapped. Her only move was to make an unthinkable sacrifice. She publicly condemned the only people she knew she could trust, playing the part of the cold, decisive monarch Valerius wanted her to be. It bought her time. It cemented her authority in the eyes of her enemies, making them underestimate her. Signing that warrant," she whispered, her eyes glistening with tears, "was like cutting out my own heart. But it was the only way to save the kingdom. For 10 years I have worn this mask, ruled with a hand of ice, all while secretly, painstakingly, dismantling his network piece by piece. I have lived every day with what I did to your family." Lyra stared at her, the world tilting on its axis. Every harsh law, every cold decision, every action that had fueled the rebellion's fire, it had all been a strategy. A long, lonely, brutal game of power played by a young queen against a master manipulator. The puzzle pieces of her investigation slammed into place with dizzying clarity. The flimsy evidence, the Duke's rise in power, the Queen's hesitant signature. It all made a terrible, tragic sense. And then the final, sickening realization hit her. He funded us, Lyra breathed, the words tasting like poison. Duke Valerius. He secretly funneled money and weapons to the rebellion. He used me. He used my grief, my hatred. He pointed me at you like a weapon to keep you off balance, while he consolidated his power. The woman before her was not a tyrant. She was a survivor, a strategist who had made an impossible choice and had been living with the consequences ever since. The hatred in Lyra's heart, the core of her entire being, dissolved completely, leaving behind a vast, aching emptiness that was quickly filled by the undeniable warmth of the mate bond. It no longer felt like a curse, but like a tragic, beautiful, and incredibly complicated truth. She looked at Serafina, truly looked at her for the first time, and saw not a queen, but a woman who was just as much a victim of Duke Valerius as she was. "We are going to destroy him," Lyra said, her voice filled with a new, cold purpose. And in Serafina's silver eyes, she saw the same steely resolve. Their alliance was forged in the fire of shared grief and a fated bond. Lyra returned to the Northern Rebellion, but this time, she carried the truth. She confronted Kale and the other leaders, laying out the evidence of the Duke's manipulation. There was disbelief, anger. Some, too blinded by years of ingrained hatred, refused to listen. But most, who had revered her parents and trusted her judgment, were swayed by the irrefutable proof. The rebellion fractured, but its heart, the part that truly fought for justice, now sided with her. Lyra became the Queen's shadow operative, using her network to feed Serafina information about Valerius's movements, his allies, his hidden assets. In the capital, Serafina began to move with a new, decisive confidence. She replaced key members of the court, promoted loyal officers within the army, and quietly seized the Duke's illicitly gained wealth. The trap was set for the Grand Council meeting on the spring equinox. Duke Valerius, arrogant and secure in his power, strode into the council chambers expecting to strong-arm the Queen into granting him more control over the military. Instead, he found the room lined with royal guards who were loyal not to him, but to their queen. Serafina sat on the onyx throne, no longer an icy effigy, but a figure of immense power and righteous fury. "Duke Valerius," she said, her voice ringing with authority, "you stand accused of high treason against the crown." He laughed, dismissive. "On what grounds?" "You have no proof, but I do," a voice said from the shadows. Lyra stepped forward, no longer in servant's livery or rebel leathers, but in the dark blue and silver colors of her house. She was a ghost from his past, a weapon he had forged now turned against him. She presented the council with the ledgers, the forged documents, the sworn testimonies she and Serafina had gathered. The proof was absolute. The Duke's face turned ashen as the depth of his exposure became clear. He was arrested, his entire network collapsing in a single day. 6 months later, the kingdom was transformed. Duke Valerius had been tried and publicly executed, and the story of his decade-long treason was known throughout the land. Lyra's family name was cleared, their titles and lands restored, their honor vindicated. The Northern Rebellion, its purpose revealed as a lie, peacefully disbanded, its members granted a royal pardon. The North, once a hotbed of sedition, was now the Queen's most loyal province. Lyra stood on a private balcony overlooking the capital's gardens, the warm spring air a gentle caress. She no longer felt the cold bite of vengeance, only a deep, quiet peace. She heard footsteps and turned to see Serafina approach, a soft smile on her face. In the months since the Duke's fall, they had navigated the treacherous terrain of their past, slowly, carefully building a new future. The mate bond, once a source of confusion and pain, was now a steady, comforting presence, a quiet hum of rightness that resonated between them. Serafina came to stand beside her, taking her hand. Her touch was no longer the imagined cold of a tyrant, but the very real warmth of her mate. "Lord Protector," Serafina murmured, a playful glint in her eyes, using one of Lyra's new, official titles. "Your Majesty," Lyra replied, her lips curving into a smile. She who had sworn to kill the queen now found her greatest joy in protecting her. Her life's purpose had not been to end a reign, but to help it truly begin. Together, they looked out at the peaceful kingdom, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. Their journey had been born from a lie, forged in tragedy, and defined by a terrible choice, but it had led them here, to the dawn of a new era of peace, truth, and a love that had, against all odds, conquered a decade of hate.